Hey, so now we're going to spend some time talking about key numbers that it's really important for you to understand. And along with this $29 presentation that you signed up for, we're going to give you a document that actually goes through and does some definitions for some of these. So you should have that with you. If you don't, I would go find it and kind of look at this, because this can get kind of confusing if we don't do this, if you don't kind of look at this. So let me just kind of back here and talk about the net operating income. So the net operating income is basically in commercial real estate, and if you're buying residential real estate to hold, that's the number that tells you how much the property is making after your income is in and all your expenses are paid except the mortgage and interest. So the reason we exclude the mortgage and interest to get to the net operating income is we kind of want a level playing field. And so the net operating income tells us basically how much the property would be making, what the cash flow would be if we had bought it cash. And so when we start looking at trying to figure out what the capitalization rate is or what the value is, we don't want to include the mortgage and the interest on that mortgage in our calculations. So the net operating income is the actual income that you make minus all the expenses except mortgage and interest. So the capital costs, we typically, the reason it is here is that when you are looking at the net operating income, when people are trying to sell a property, they do not include the capital costs. Capital costs are basically how much I'm going to hold out or how much I am going to put in reserves so that I can do some upkeep. I can keep the property in good shape. And so it is not truly an expense. It is something I'm going to put in every year. I'm going to do some kind of upgrades or improvements. So when people go to sell a property, they typically do not include capital costs in their NOI. However, when I go to buy properties, I always include what I think my capital costs are going to be for me to figure out what I'm going to offer. Because if I do not put money back into the property, it is going to go downhill. So these are just kind of rough numbers, but for an apartment I'm going to be calculating about $250 a door, a mobile home park, a mobile home about $100, and self-storage about $75. And actually self-storage can be a little bit less. You can be looking at $50 to $70 to $75. Okay. So now what we're going to be doing, what the next thing is let me back up for a minute. So if I had a 10-unit property, 10-unit apartments, I'm going to add $2,500, $250 times 10, to my expenses. And so my net operating income is going to be $2,500 less, right? So let's talk about debt service. So the debt service is basically your mortgage and the interest on that mortgage. So the debt service ratio is the second most important number that we need to know after the net operating income. So the debt service coverage ratio, or DSR, DSCR, is what it is known in the industry. Basically is telling you how much cash flow you have left What is the percent of that you have left after you have paid the mortgage? So if I have, to make it easy, if I have a debt service of $1,000 a month, and after I have paid all my expenses, I have $1,100 left, then if I divide the $1,000 mortgage into the $1,100 cash flow, or cash after, $1,100 into my net operating income, I end up with what is 1.1. So I have 10% over what my debt service and interest are as cash flow. So let me just say that again. So the debt service is my mortgage and interest. My debt service coverage ratio, or DSR, is how much I have left, what my NOI is after I've paid all of my expenses. And so my debt service coverage ratio is basically my NOI divided by my mortgage, and I'm going to get a fraction. If I don't have, banks are not going to lend on anything that doesn't have a debt coverage ratio of at least 1.2 to 1.3. That means you have 20 to 30% cash flow left after all the bills, including the mortgage, are paid. So if you think about that, if you only have 10% left, how many times do you have some kind of oops happen in a month where something goes wrong, or you have an extra bill or something? And if you don't have that extra coverage or that extra cover, you can be in a negative cash flow very soon. And it's not going to take very many months for you to have a negative cash flow, negative situation where you can't cover all of the expenses and the mortgage. So you really want, I'm in concurrence with the bank here, you really want, going into this, a debt coverage ratio of 1.2 to 1.3. So 20 to 30% more left after you've paid all the expenses, including the mortgage and interest. After you take out the mortgage and interest, what's left is the cash flow before taxes. And that really tells you what your cash flow is, what you would have to distribute after all the bills are paid. So typically, when we are looking at buying something, one of the main things that James and I look at is the cash on cash return. So how hard is our money working for us, right? So for us to figure out what the cash on cash return is, you have to know what your total acquisition costs are. And the total acquisition costs are not just your down payment. Those total acquisition costs are going to include all of your closing costs, your lawyer's fees, your third-party reports, which are like the appraisal, the phase one. It's going to include any money you have to bring in to set up your books, to do some immediate repairs. So it's the amount of money you need to bring into closing to get this property closed, all the bills paid, and you having money to set up the accounts. So when I am looking at my cash on cash return, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to take my cash flow that's left after what I think my cash flow is going to be, and I'm going to divide it by my total acquisition costs. So if I have a cash flow in a year for 10 units, after all the bills are paid, of of $10,000, say, and my total acquisition costs were $200,000, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my $10,000 and I'm going to divide it by the $200,000, right? And that's going to give me my cash on cash return. So if I'm buying something, I want to be able, particularly if I'm going to have investors in this, they are going to want a minimum of an 8% cash on cash return based on all their money. And you have to have some of that money too. So you have to have a cash on cash return that's going to be better than 8%. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about here is capitalization rate versus cost per door. So the capitalization rate we talked about up here, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, is if you take the what is left for at the end of the year for the net operating income. So for your yearly net operating income, and you're going to divide that by how much you had to pay, what the cost of the property is. This is not the acquisition cost. This is what they're selling the property for. So that's going to give you your capitalization rate. And I think I have a slide here in just a couple minutes where we're going to show you a couple of examples. So I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about why we tend to use capitalization rate to understand how to compare one property to another versus the cost per door. So the cost per door, and you're going to see brokers using the cost per door a fair amount. So they will show you on their property packages or their offering memos what the other properties are that have sold in the area. And they're going to tell you how much each of those properties sold for, how many units it was, and what the cost per door was. So meaning that property A sold for $40,000 a door, property B sold for $38,000, property C sold for $42,000, and they are asking you to pay $40,000, and they're telling you that's a good comparison. Well, I want to tell you it could be, but it well may not be. And the reason is that what's behind that cost per door, you don't know if property A, B, or C, what any of their net operating incomes are. So the property that you got $42,000 cost per door, their net operating income was 10% higher or 10% lower. And so using a cost per door to figure out comparisons just doesn't work a lot of times. You really need to be able to understand what the net operating income is.